Most people who run businesses treat complaints like speed bumps, annoying, avoidable, temporary. But that day, when a child stepped into the glass foyer with a folded list and shoes too big at the toes, the complaint became a mirror. What started as a small petition turned into an unraveling of a life Henry thought he understood, and the first line on that paper would change the way he counted value forever. Henry's office door opened onto the usual view. The city wore itself out across the horizon, traffic sketching precise lines of impatience, the glass of his suite throwing back the sun like a polished coin. He liked that view because it reminded him that everything had an order. Metrics, margins, projections, neatly stacked so that chaos stayed at the edges. He did not, in 1,000 memos, expect a child to disturb it. It was a Tuesday that felt as ordinary as any other. The elevator doors parted, and in walked a small boy no taller than the receptionist's desk. He carried a cardboard box and a folded sheet of lined paper, edges soft with handling. His hair stuck up as if he had been hugging a pillow all night, and his jacket was 2 sizes too large, one of those hand-me-downs that smelled faintly of someone else's holidays. People in the lobby glanced as the boy moved like a slow, polite ripple through the flow of suits. No one stopped him, no one thought to. Henry was finishing a phone call when his assistant poked her head in with the kind of urgency that did not yet admit trouble. "Sir, there's a boy at reception who says he needs to see you. He says it's urgent." Henry arched an eyebrow. "Send him up," he said, intending to be short. He had time to spare for interruptions if they were entertaining, scandalous, or strategically useful. This did not look like any of those. When the boy arrived at his glass door, he paused as if checking he was in the right place. Then he looked up at Henry with the steady eye of someone who had rehearsed courage for many nights. "My name is Noah," he said, voice thin but precise. "I need to talk to you about the shelter program." Henry felt a small annoyance. The shelter program was an internal initiative, useful, well-run, placed perfectly on the philanthropy ledger. "We have a charity director. Why come to me?" he asked. Noah opened the cardboard box and set it on the coffee table between them. Inside were neat stacks of paper, envelopes, a small tin with coins, and a faded photograph of a woman with a tired smile. "They're not listening," Noah said. "I made a list." Henry glanced at the sheets. On top was a single piece of lined paper, folded twice. He unfolded it with the distance of a man who treated pages like contracts until words softened his hands. The handwriting was slanted and careful, as if the author had practiced in moonlight. The list read, "Heat in the winter room is broken. Mom says we wake with cold in our bones. The shelter takes sheets at 9 a.m., but sometimes they forget our name. Little Adam needs medicine for his cough. He can't sleep. The bus pass machine is broken. We miss classes. No adult there speaks to us like we matter. Please fix these." There was nothing revolutionary about it. It was a child's inventory of suffering. What surprised Henry was how precise it was, how small the grievances, each one a little hinge that made the rest swing open. "Why not tell the director?" Henry asked, voice softening despite himself. Noah's mouth tightened. "He filed forms. They put stickers on them and then they disappear in a drawer. I made this list so you could see it. People leave the shelter because the heater is broken and the bus pass doesn't work. People leave and end up on the street." There was a dignity in his smallness that had nothing to do with posture, only need. Henry remembered a boy who had once been younger than Noah and had worn a thin jacket in a world that expected him to thaw on his own. A memory he thought long banked up like savings began to leak into his present. He asked for the shelter's name. Noah answered in one word, "The Sparrow House." "You came by yourself?" Henry asked. "Yes." Noah's eyes were steady. "Mom got sick last month. The doctor said shelter care would be safe for a while, but we had to wait. The bus is how we go to school and the clinic. I made a list because I am tired of waiting." Henry listened as Noah described things with the concrete logic children use when they want to be believed. The room that smelled of damp, the radiator that clicked and clicked but did not warm, the small boy who coughed in the night, and the nurse who said, "We'll see tomorrow." The litany knit together into a pattern Henry could no longer dismiss as administrative noise. He pressed a button on his desk, more reflex than plan. "Olivia, bring the shelter reports and the last 2 months' maintenance requests." His assistant flinched. No one asked for that data unless they intended change. When the files arrived, they told the same story in formal numbers. Requests filed, tickets closed, yet complaints persisted. A layer of indifference had accumulated where action should have been. Possibilities unfurled. Hire a contractor, expedite the bus pass repair, move a fund allocation. They were small shifts in corporate flow, but to Noah and the people at Sparrow House, they would be life-smoothing instead of life-shaping. Henry found himself making calls that afternoon he had never prioritized in a decade. He spoke to a facility manager who suggested a wait of 3 weeks for a heating contractor. He spoke to a transportation liaison who said the machine needed a part that shipped in 10 days. He made a decision then, 2 words he rarely allowed himself: expedite everything. The projects that took months in departmental inertia were suddenly first in line. Noah watched with a mixture of disbelief and gratitude. "You're going to fix it?" he asked, like a plea, but also like a test. "I'm going to try," Henry said, the admission tasting unfamiliar yet right. The first domino clogged the corridors almost immediately. When the maintenance team arrived at Sparrow House within 48 hours and found the radiator rusted through, they ordered an emergency replacement. The bus pass kiosk was fixed that week. The shelter's inventory of sheets was reorganized with new labels that could not be ignored. A nurse was reassigned to ensure the clinic's pediatric queue moved more quickly. But even as Henry set wheels in motion, he felt something tug at him that had nothing to do with logistics. Noah's photograph of a smiling woman with a tired smile kept returning to his mind. "Mom?" he asked gently. Noah nodded. "Her name is Lila. She got sick after the factory closed. She coughs a lot. The doctor says she needs tests." His voice dropped to a fragile whisper. "We've been on the waiting list for months." Those words had a way of folding the world inward. Henry, who measured time in quarters and returns, felt the scale of a different accounting, the currency of time spent waiting while a body got worse. He arranged, without theatrics, for a first-line diagnostic appointment for Lila at a partner clinic. He asked a nurse he barely knew to open a slot. He authorized small sums from a corporate fund, nothing public, nothing grand, just the blunt tools of access. Noah left that afternoon with a box lighter and eyes that had learned again how to trust a plan. He ran down the steps like someone sprinting for breath and hope at once. Henry watched him go, noticing for the first time how the city looked different when he made a small thing move faster. When the first repair crew texted him a photo of the replaced radiator and a note, "Warm now," Henry felt an odd satisfaction. It was not the same as when a merger closed or a stock ticked upward. It was a soft, human shift. Yet as the week unfolded and Sparrow House's small victories accumulated, Henry realized he had opened something bigger than a maintenance ticket. Noah returned the following Tuesday with another sheet, this one shorter. He had ridden the fixed bus and gone to the clinic with his mother. He sat across from Henry and, without preamble, asked, "Can I keep helping? I made a list, but I can also help fix things. I can learn. I can be someone who helps." Henry, who had been a man of decisions measured in boardrooms, felt the ground move. The simple ask, "Can I help?" sat in the air like a bell. "Come by next week," Henry said before he could reason why it was unwise. "Work with facilities. Learn how things get done." Noah beamed. "I'll bring another list," he said, as if that were the most natural promise in the world. As the boy left, box under his arm, Henry sat back and felt a small fissure widen in his usual certainty. A child's folded list had nudged him into a corridor of consequence where paper did not mean profit but presence. He did not yet know where that corridor ended. He only knew he was standing at its threshold, and something in him, a ledger long ballasted by numbers, had made room for a different kind of accounting. The first part of a chain had clicked. The next would require more than repaired radiators and quicker appointments. It would require a choice about what to do when the problem wasn't maintenance but a system. And Henry, whose instincts preferred the concrete, could sense that systems were about to ask for more than fixes. They would ask for reform. When the radiator was fixed and the bus pass kiosk hummed again, Sparrow House seemed to breathe. Children who had been curled in sweaters on plastic chairs stretched their fingers and found room to move. A nurse with a tired ponytail high-fived Noah in the hallway as if the victory were partly his. Small things added up, and for a weekend, the shelter felt less like a holding room for misfortune and more like a place where people could sleep without fear of waking frozen. Henry watched all of it through a window at his office. No grand applause, no press release, only the quiet satisfaction that came from seeing a plan executed. He told himself the decisions had been practical. Reroute a contractor, shift a fund, call in a favor. He had repaired infrastructure. He had moved levers. That should have been enough. But Noah carried another piece of weather into the office that Monday, one that did not fit neatly into maintenance tickets or emergency slots. He arrived with a new stack of papers, smaller, more personal. On top was a short note in a child's steady hand. Mom has other tests. They say something else might be wrong. Henry felt a familiar hollowness then, the kind that followed a market dip, a precise, cold anxiety that asked for numbers to make it better. But this was not numbers. Lila's tests showed a shadow on a scan, possibilities the doctors discussed in words like protocol and monitor. The initial wave of small victories had not changed the deeper bottom-line reality. Health and housing were braided, and fixing one pipe did not fix the entire plumbing. Noah spoke about waiting rooms and the way adults moved when given bad news. Fast, then slow, then brittle. They told Mom to go to a specialist, he said, but the specialist is weeks away, and they said sometimes it's too late. The sentence hit Henry with the bluntness of a bell. Time mattered, and waiting was dangerous. Henry's reaction was not theatrical. He moved in the legal, quiet way he always did. A sequence of calls, a scheduling, a pressure applied where people had assumed pressure would never be applied. He arranged the specialist appointment. He called the clinic director and asked for an expedited review. He called his philanthropic liaison and quietly authorized funds to cover immediate tests and a short rehabilitation program if needed. He did not announce any of it. He told himself this was logistics again. Noah watched Henry's decisions like a pupil watching a craftsman. "Why are you helping us?" he asked one afternoon as they both stood by a radiator that had been quietly humming for days. Henry paused. He could have spoken about duty or corporate citizenship, but Noah's eyes were too honest for platitudes. "Because someone had to listen," he said finally. "Because they were asking to be seen." That answer was enough for Noah. He went home and brought back lists of other things, simple, fixable things that had been overlooked for months. He began to learn how maintenance calls were logged and how committees met. Henry let him shadow a facilities manager for a day, handing him a hard hat that swallowed his head. Noah learned how to read a work order and how to insist a task stayed at the top of a queue. In the small hours between files and calls, Henry found himself reading reports he would have ignored before. Housing lists, mental health referrals, the names of families who had used Sparrow House for years. He discovered that the shelter's problems were not just broken radiators, but fragile funding streams, a rotating door of volunteers, and a municipal bureaucracy that did not prioritize the small neighborhoods where people like Lila lived. Repairing the radiator had been necessary and visible, but not sufficient. When the specialist delivered the diagnosis, it landed like a weather report that neither Noah nor Henry could predict. The shadow on Lila's scan required a range of treatments, including a costly surgical intervention that the clinic recommended within days. The cost was not astronomical in the world of hospitals and private care, but it was a cliff no one at Sparrow House could climb without a rope. Henry called his CFO out of habit. "Allocate funds," he said simply. There was grumbling, questions about precedent, concerns about donor expectations. Henry answered in a way he had rarely used in boardrooms, with a story. He described a child's folded paper, a bus pass fixed, a night without cold. Small narrative details that made the numbers breathe. The CFO arranged a transfer. The operation date was set. But help arrived with pushback in other places. Evan Keller, quiet until he needed to be sharp, began to voice concerns in meetings. "We have to be careful," he said, leaning forward like a question mark. "How does this scale? Who decides who gets help? Where does it stop?" Henry wanted to answer with moral clarity, but the world required procedure. He convened lawyers and auditors and insisted the fund be transparent, with criteria and safeguards. He insisted it be institutional, not personal. He did not want the charity to be a story about him. He wanted it to be a reliable tool that could not be shelved at the next quarterly meeting. Noah, who had matured overnight into a small organizer, watched this unfold with a kind of adult seriousness in a child's face. He began to enlist other shelter residents for small tasks, an inventory of shortages, a map of clinic wait times, a rota for volunteers. The work shifted from being someone else's pity project to being a project the community ran itself, with outside help when necessary. When Lila returned from surgery, pale but alive, the shelter erupted in a way that felt like a festival. Children made cards, nurses cried quietly at the doorway, and Noah sat with his mother and did not let her shoulders sag under worry. It was a tender scene. Henry felt the edges of his heart loosen in an unfamiliar softening. He had arranged a bed, a surgeon, and a plan. He had fixed a radiator and a kiosk. He had, in small, practical ways, bought time. But time was complicated. Recovery was slow, and the rent notice for Lila's apartment still sat like a dull threat. The next step, the hard bureaucratic step, was to make sure Lila had a home to return to. Without stable housing, every medical victory risked being erased. Henry had seen the arithmetic. One eviction could unravel months of care. He convened a small team to work on temporary housing vouchers, negotiated with a landlord who begrudgingly agreed to delay proceedings, and set up a caseworker from the community fund to help with benefits applications. Yet even as solutions mounted, a leak spread elsewhere. News of Henry's quiet interventions, small items on internal feeds, the odd volunteer, began to leak out into town gossip. A local reporter called an old contact at Morgan Enterprises. The first piece was small and empathetic, not flattering, but it spread. The company's philanthropic initiatives were suddenly a topic at board dinners and investor calls. Evans smelled opportunity in the limelight and in the dissent it could create. One evening, Henry found a note on his desk from the board. "We need to discuss transparency and policy regarding community interventions." The language was neutral. The meaning was clear. There would be oversight. There would be questions. There would be a formal inquiry into how funds were being allocated. Henry read the note and thought of Noah's folded list, of the tiny, exact grievances, broken heat, missed sheets, coughs in the night that had started this chain. He weighed the cost of bureaucracy against the cost of a child sleeping without warmth. Noah, oblivious to boardroom memos and investor tensions, kept making lists. He came by Henry's office one afternoon with a new idea, a community repair program where Morgan Enterprises would train shelter residents in basic maintenance and employ them for building work. "People can fix stuff for money," Noah said proudly. "Then they can pay rent and get nice again." Henry smiled at the boy's practical imagination. The idea was sound and, if done right, scalable. It would require time, trainers, and a commitment from the firm that wasn't performative. It would also require him to defend it to a board that liked tidy returns. The part ends on a small, resolute promise. Henry sat at his desk, looking at a photo of Noah and Lila that the shelter had sent him, smiles tired but genuine, and drafted an email to the board. He would propose the community repair program. He would propose policy changes that protected families like Lila's. He would risk the conservative certainty of his company's cadence for something messier and more human. But the email was also an invitation to conflict. Evan would contest it. Donors would ask questions. And more importantly, Henry would be forced to reconcile the scales of his life. The balance sheet that built empires and the broken lists that asked simply to be seen. The decision was a hinge. Henry hit send and watched the cursor blink, like a second of silence before an orchestra begins again. The first morning of the community repair program felt like a small rebellion dressed as work. The training room Henry had cleared out smelled of coffee and cardboard, and in the middle of that makeshift classroom, Noah stood with a hard hat too big for his head and eyes sharp with focus. A retired facilities foreman from the company, calloused hands and a patience shaped by decades of pipework, taught how to read a maintenance ticket, how to swap a radiator valve, and how to tighten a loose hinge so it didn't scream in the night. Emma's old lists were pinned on the wall like a map. Broken heater, bus pass, medicine for cough. The paper had been bureaucratized into curriculum. The shelter residents learned with hunger, practical skills that might convert into stable work, a promise of wages steady enough to keep a roof from growing thin at the corners. The company supplied tools, a small stipend, and a trainer. The shelter supplied people who wanted a hand up instead of a handout. Noah was relentless. He arrived early, sleeves pushed up, absorbing instructions like a sponge. He practiced measuring twice and cutting once until the foreman, who had been patient to a fault, smiled and nodded as if Noah had become one of those rare apprentices who understood more than motion. He understood dignity in motion. Lila came by sometimes, pale but steady, sitting in the back with a thermos and a grateful expression that looked sweeter than any applause. Word of the program threaded through Morgan Enterprises in a cautious, gossip-tinted way. Some employees walked by the training room and slowed, as if they were seeing an animal they only half recognized. People with stories instead of slides. Others rolled their eyes and muttered about scope creep. Evan, always attentive to the narrow angles of risk, watched the program like a hawk, his jaw a constant assertion that comfort should not be mistaken for correctness. But in the morning light of the training room, the world felt startlingly simple. A man who could fix a radiator could be paid to fix a radiator. The money moved quietly from an account line to a paycheck, and for one brief stretch, the arithmetic was humane. People who had once braced for cold nights discovered they could count on warmth. A child who folded a list into brave tiny squares began folding a different kind of life into being. Henry spent long afternoons checking progress. He liked to believe he was invisible, an executive who watched from the glass. But the people in the program began greeting him by name, offering small updates as if he were a supervisor rather than a stranger who happened to open a door. "We tightened the screws in 3B, Noah told him once, voice proud. "Mrs. Almeida's heater works now." The pride that stitched into the words landed in Henry like a small currency he had not used in years. Then the first test of scale arrived. A supplier, one of the companies contracted to supply parts for the training program, ran late. A shipment of valves was delayed and a module of the training had to be postponed. It was small, fixable, but in the rhythm of a pilot project, small problems multiplied into the appearance of failure. Evan seized on it. "We cannot have operational hiccups in a pilot that will be used to justify permanent funding," he said at an early steering committee. "If we want to institutionalize this, we need vendor reliability and measurable ROI." Henry answered calmly in the committee. "We have measurable impact. Noah's list turned into a schedule of interventions. People are employed. Rent notices are being withdrawn. That has value." He produced attendance sheets, small surveys filled out by residents about confidence levels and practical skills. The room applauded politely. Evan's eyes narrowed, not in the moral way, but in the investor way. He wanted a clause to make the program invisible if it ever risked profile. It should have remained an internal quarrel. It did not. Someone on the board leaked an innocuous line to a local paper, the kind of human interest that could make headlines and discomfort investors used to spreadsheets. The story was kind, careful, framed as community partnership. The next morning, an email arrived at Henry's desk marked urgent. A donor who had been earmarked for the company's philanthropic wing was reconsidering their support. The email language was neutral. Given recent shifts in strategy, we are evaluating our commitments. The subtext was clear. Visibility had made the donors nervous. Evan moved faster. He called a closed-door meeting with several board members and read a dry document that made Henry's stomach tighten. A risk assessment, a list of possible reputational exposures if the program expanded without airtight governance. The memo's tone was legal and careful, but the effect was the same as a cold hand on the back of Henry's neck. Reassess or be reassessed. Henry pushed back. He explained the human stories, the radiator in 3B, Lila's recovery, Noah learning to read a work order. He argued the long-term payoff of community stability, employee retention, brand loyalty, a workforce less likely to fray under personal crises. He argued tangibly because his world was one that required tangibility. But when he returned to his office, he found a printed copy of Evan's risk memo taped to his chair. That night, Morgan Enterprises' glossy corridors felt thin and familiar. Henry sat alone under the dim office light and thought through worst-case scenarios. Donors withdrawing funds, a board vote to restrict the program, an audit that turned generosity into headline risk. He could engineer contingencies, reallocate from reserves, repackage the program as a contractual partnership with nonprofits. But each contingency felt like patchwork over a fissure that wanted more durable mending. Noah knocked and entered, carrying a new list with the innocent seriousness of someone bringing a weekly grocery inventory. He sat, cheeks still dusty from the day's work. "They said the donor might pull out," he said without preamble. "Will that mean the program end? Will you stop the training?" His words were small but precise. The question carried the weight of a whole community. Henry felt the cold ledger return. This is where numbers had always hurt him before he let them be softened by faces. He folded the memo into his hands like an old letter. "I don't know yet," he admitted, the honesty raw and clean. "But we're not going to stop because of one donor. We'll find ways. We'll tighten the operations. We'll make our case." Noah's eyes filled with a child's version of adult worry. "But people need this now," he said. "Mrs. Caldwell got a notice. Mr. Singh's son needs medicine. If it stops—" "Then it's not really a program," Henry finished for him. "It's a campaign. We need permanence, not headlines." They both sat in the silence that followed, two people whose worlds had collided and found fragile common ground. Outside, the city moved with its dim geometry. Inside, a man who had been a fortress and a boy who had made lists both understood the stakes. If the program failed now, it would set back years of fragile trust. It would teach the shelter residents that help could be withdrawn like a promise, no matter how many hours of sweat they poured into change. The next morning, Henry compiled numbers, testimonies, and a tight operational plan to present to the board. He walked into the meeting with photos pinned to his chest. No white paper, no jargon, just faces and a simple metric: lives changed. Evan arrived prepared with legal caveats and shredded logic he had polished to a shine. The meeting began with heat and ended with no resolution. A vote would be called the following week. Henry left the room with the taste of copper in his mouth and the knowledge that a single pen could undo what months of work had built. Back at his office, an envelope sat on his desk, unmarked, heavy in a way paper should not be. Inside was a single printed copy of a newspaper clipping. "Number of corporate philanthropy failures rises." The headline was generic, the sting was specific. Noah came by later with another note, hands trembling. "We raised £10 today washing windows," he said, pride and worry braided together. "It's not much, but it's ours." He held the coins out as if they were a talisman. Henry took them with reverence. The small, bright metal pieces weighed more than most investments the board discussed. They were proof of something stubborn and true. When people were given the chance to help themselves, they did. But the board's vote loomed like a storm. Part 3 closed on the image of Henry walking into the glass-walled meeting room, a folder of testimony in his hands and a hard, thin resolve in his chest. As the board chair called the meeting to order, Henry realized the next hour would not only decide the program's fate, it might decide who sat in his chair at all. The boardroom smelled of lemon polish and old authority. Portraits of past chairs lined the walls like sentinels, and the long table gleamed under lights that had seen every kind of corporate confession. Henry walked in with a folder of testimonies, no PowerPoint, just photographs, attendance sheets, and the careful notes of people whose lives had shifted a little because the radiator in 3B had been fixed. He felt the weight of those papers like a ledger that finally contained names instead of numbers. Evan spoke first, his voice silk over steel. He laid out worst-case scenarios in the meticulous language of law and optics. Donors withdrawn, brand risk, precedent for private interventions without institutional guardrails. He didn't deny the good the pilot had done. He framed it as a business problem needing policy, not personality. Henry watched the room tilt in small ways. A board member's jaw tightening, a hand stroking a chin. He understood the math that moved this table. He also understood the other math, the slow subtraction families like Lila's endured every day when bureaucracy was the only answer. He stood to speak, palms flat on the table, and told the story simply. Of a boy with a folded list and a radiator still humming. Of a mother who came back from surgery because someone cut through red tape. Of people learning to work so they might pay rent. He did not use rhetoric. He used faces. Then Noah entered the room. He had come, unannounced, carrying with him a small tin of coins Noah had raised washing windows and a trembling piece of paper with signatures from shelter residents. "I meant to bring my list," he said, voice small but steady. "But the list is long now. Jobs, medicine, warm nights. People signed because they want to say thank you." He looked around the room, unafraid. "Please don't let it stop." There is a pressure in seeing a child ask for continuity rather than charity. Some people shifted, embarrassed. Others put on the professional mask tighter. A few board members leaned forward, moved by the testimonies, or maybe simply by the optics. Evan leaned back, expression unreadable. The vote was called. The board chair cleared his throat and began the ritual. Motions, seconds, counters. Henry felt the room's rhythm like a pulse. He had prepared spreadsheets, legal frameworks, and contingency plans to make the program robust. He had argued for governance and transparent metrics. Yet he knew metrics alone would not protect a woman's recovery or a child's steady sleep. When the tally came, the result was a thin division. A majority agreed to institutionalize the program, but with strict conditions. An outside audit, a rebranding under a controlled foundation, and a limit on discretionary spending. It was a compromise that read like victory on paper and like restraint in the margins. The program would live, so long as it met bureaucratic thresholds that had never been tested in the messy, urgent language of human need. Relief should have followed. Instead, an email arrived that same afternoon. A donor had withdrawn a pledged sum, citing strategic realignment. The money was not small. It had underwritten a third of the first year's training modules. The board murmured. Evan's eyes, cold and quick, seemed to smile at a staccato rhythm only he could hear. Henry felt the sudden physical drop of consequence. Rooms to be repaired, stipends to be paid, a payroll now at risk. He knew the easy route. Shelve the program until funding stabilized, restructure the pilot, ask for more time. He also knew what that would mean to the people waiting. A night without heat for a family recovering from surgery, a trainee left with tools but no wages. That evening, Henry went to the Sparrow House. He arrived not in a suit but in a jacket, his tie loosened. The shelter smelled of soup and laundry and the kind of quiet that holds many small, fierce lives. Lila sat by a window, her scarf on, and Noah waved like someone returning from a worthy errand. The people there had begun to make small plans for the future, and the fragility of those plans pressed against Henry's ribs. "Donor pulled out," he said without preface. He watched their faces fold and rearrange into practical concern, the kind that requires immediate lists and solutions rather than pity. Noah handed him the 10 of coins. "We've got this much," he said, pride stubborn in the corners of his voice. "We can cover 2 days of bus passes." The 10 was nearly empty but full of meaning. Henry put his hand in his pocket and took out a card he rarely used, a personal line for discretionary philanthropy that existed in legal gray and private hands. He had not intended to use it like this, not for projects that might prompt spreadsheets and meetings. But the small, steady eyes around him made the decision easy in the way moral choices occasionally are when faced with naked need. "I'll underwrite the program for 3 months personally," he said, "not as publicity, discreetly, enough to keep wages paid and the training going while we restructure and find sustainable donors." Lila reached for his hand, and for the first time, Henry let himself feel what his money could do when used without press statements. The gratitude there was not theatrical. It was the quiet that collects when someone hands you time. When he returned to the office with the receipt for his wire transfer, an action he handled with the curt efficiency that had guided most of his life, he found the board in full motion. Evan had prepared a countermeasure, a proposal that would move the program under a third-party nonprofit umbrella with strict oversight and donor controls. The board split between a desire for speed and a need for protection. Henry expected gratitude for his private move. Instead, the response was mixed. Some argued he had bypassed governance, others suggested it solved the immediate problem. The debate illuminated something he had not fully considered. His personal intervention, while life-saving, also risks the program's institutional future because it personalized what needed to be structural. "If the program depends on your personal funds," one board member said, "it will fail when you are gone." The words felt like a warning more than a critique. Henry understood their practical logic. He also understood the moral calculus. If he carved a path this way, he might keep roofs over heads for months, but he might weaken the argument that the company itself had responsibility. That night, laid and alone in his office, Henry sat with the ledger of his choices. He had wired money to keep people paid. He had signed off on training modules and negotiated with vendors. He had also risked the appearance, perhaps the reality, that this was now his personal project. He slept poorly, waking to the sound of a phone buzzing with donor outreach and PR inquiries. He had bought time, and time was a rare currency. But buying time came at a cost: scrutiny, the possibility of backlash, and the slow, grinding reality that generosity without systems can become an anecdote rather than an institution. At dawn, he found a small note taped to his desk, a child's drawing of a heater with a smiling sun above it, and the words, in blocky letters, "Thank you." Noah had left the sketch. Henry pinned it above his monitor. It was both blessing and pressure, reminder and indictment. Part 4 closed on the image of Henry walking back to the shelter at first light, his hands in his pockets and a new resolve set in his shoulders. He had kept the program alive for now, but the real work, building structures that could not be undone by a single donor's withdrawal or a board's changing mood, lay ahead. He had made a sacrifice. He now had to make sure it birthed permanence rather than dependence. The next chapter would require more than patched radiators and private checks. It would require a redefinition of responsibility, corporate, communal, and personal. And Henry, who had always counted in margins, would have to learn to count in people. The morning of the program's review felt like standing at a hinge. Months of small, stubborn work had brought Henry to a moment where choices would translate into policy, or into a memory. The boardroom again smelled of lemon polish and polite caution. But this time, Henry carried a different kind of packet. Not just photos and attendance sheets, but contracts, partnership letters from verified nonprofits, a draft for a community-run social enterprise, and a budget that balanced compassion with accountability. He spoke first, not with the bluntness of a lone benefactor, but with the discipline of a man who had learned how fragile lives could be if left to goodwill alone. He proposed that Morgan Enterprises seed a permanent ring-fenced endowment for community resilience, staffed independently, audited quarterly, and run in partnership with local NGOs. He proposed that the company contract the newly trained crew from the Sparrow House repair program for light maintenance across several municipal buildings, creating wage pathways and a steady revenue stream that would repay part of the program's costs. He proposed an oversight board that included residents from the shelter itself, people who had lived the problems and knew how to solve them. Evan cleared his throat and pushed back, not out of malice but from habit. Risk was his language. "What about donors?" he asked. "What if this becomes a recurring budget line? Investors will want returns." Henry answered with a calm that surprised even him. "The return is community stability, fewer emergency absences among our own workforce, lower turnover, better brand resilience. And economically, rehousing a family costs far less than the social services we pay later. But beyond that, this is the kind of risk a company can take if it wants to stay part of a city rather than above it." The board deliberated longer than Henry expected. Arguments were made with spreadsheets and with anecdotes. At one point, Noah stood at the doorway, older somehow in quiet ways, and the room fell softer. The board chair tapped a pen and looked at the faces pinned in Henry's folder. Lila's wiped hands, a photo of a repaired radiator, a training session with hard hats too big for heads. The decision, when it came, felt less like triumph and more like a carefully negotiated truce between profit and purpose. The program was institutionalized with safeguards, a permanent fund, an independent director, a measured revenue model, and a clause that protected discretionary emergency access. Donors were courted not as saviors but as partners with clear, auditable outcomes. Evan's cautions were folded into policy language. His voice remained, but it softened where data met dignity. Outside the glass tower, change didn't roar. It moved in small, human increments. The Sparrow House crew received their first contracted job from the city, refurbishing a community center that had long been neglected. The work paid a living wage, and their pride showed in clean hands and straightened shoulders. Noah learned how to read invoices and count margins. He learned how wage statements worked and how to save a little of his pay for a chipped mug and a future he had not dared imagine. Lila's recovery continued. With housing stabilized through a matching rental assistance program and part-time opportunities found through the social enterprise, she was able to attend follow-up appointments without the cloud of eviction notices. She started a small sewing circle at the community center, mending garments and learning how to market simple items at weekend markets. Her smile, when it arrived, was steady and not perfunctory. It was the shape of someone who had been given room to breathe. The program's early months produced stories that did not make headlines, but lived in kitchens and on stoops. Mr. Singh, whose son needed medicine, was able to pick up a stable shift through the repair crew. The medicine was no longer rationed. Mrs. Caldwell, who had faced an eviction notice, received counseling and a job referral. The tin of coins Noah had once held now sat behind glass in the community center as a relic of where they'd started. A reminder that small things could seed big change. For Henry, the effects were less tangible but no less real. He found himself leaving the office some evenings to sit in the community center's worn chairs and listen. He learned to talk with people without translating everything into market terms. He learned that decisions carried faces, not just forecasts. He still negotiated deals and watched quarterly results, but the ledger on his desk now included other columns. Names, nights saved, the count of children who slept warm. There were strains. Donors asked for metrics. Auditors requested more data. A few board members grumbled at quarterly reports that did not translate neatly into stock metrics. Henry had expected friction. He had not expected the way those frictions would refine the program, forcing it to be leaner and more durable. The oversight the board demanded ultimately made the fund stronger, not weaker. Rules made the charity less vulnerable to caprice. Evan remained in the company but shifted his stance. He began to see that stability could impact bottom lines in indirect but powerful ways. He visited the community center once and helped teach a workshop on risk assessment, dryly at first. Later he admitted, half-grudgingly, that the program's data showed reduced absenteeism among several contract partners. It was a small concession. It counted. The true turning point came on a late autumn day when the first cohort of Sparrow House trainees received their certificates. The ceremony was modest: a folding table, a cake someone had baked, and a line of neighbors and company volunteers who had learned to see the same faces every day. Henry stood at the back, his hands folded, a child's drawing of a heater still pinned in his office like an heirloom. Noah went first, speaking into a borrowed microphone with the steady breath of someone who had learned accountability and with it, confidence. "We made lists," he said, voice steady now. "Then we fixed things. Then we got paid for fixing things. Now we can keep roofs from going away. That's not magic, it's work." The applause that followed felt like a kind of absolution, not for Henry, but for a city that had tolerated distance for too long. People hugged, laughed, and took photographs without pretense. After the ceremony, Lila found Henry and pressed a small scarf into his hand, one she had knitted in the recovery room. Her eyes shone with a thank you that did not need an audience. Noah leaned on Henry's shoulder and whispered, "We did it." Henry thought of the first folded list in the lobby, a child's simple inventory of what a community needed. He thought of the tin of coins and the radiator that hummed. He thought of the nights at the hospital and the boardroom votes and the private wire transfer he'd made in a moment of raw decision. None of it was clean. None of it would be a footnote in an annual report if the accounting stayed old. But it was real. That evening, back at his office, he took down the child's drawing of the heater and slid it into a folder, labeled Community. He added Noah's first list and the tin of coins photo. He wrote a short note across the top: "Make it permanent." He pushed the folder into a drawer that had once only contained contracts, and he closed it with a small, private smile. The ending was not dramatic. It was a slow migration. Systems that learned to listen, a company that learned to act, people who learned to expect help that did not vanish when headlines cooled. Henry did not become a saint. He remained keen, sometimes impatient, often pragmatic. But something in him had shifted. The ledger now held faces. When he sat looking out across the city, the view felt different. Less like a coin to be polished and more like a community to be tended. Noah's list sat, folded and worn, on Henry's desk for months afterwards. Sometimes he would unfold it and read the simple lines: the heater, the bus pass, the cough, and he would be reminded how small things, when met, can keep people whole. On a gray morning sometime later, Henry placed the list on a public board in the lobby of Morgan Enterprises, a quiet sign that the company would remember where it began. The child who once handed him a paper had taught him one last lesson. Systems change when people decide they must, and sometimes the person who thinks they are giving the gift is the one who gets saved, slowly, quietly, by the work of caring.